Good morning, all, and welcome to Purdue. There's folks as old as 10 months old here, which is wonderful to see that they start early to learn about the life course, etc. Welcome to all of you, Purdue colleagues, family, friends. Welcome to the Lou Anna Day Distinguished Lecture. It's truly a privilege for me to participate in this event. It's always a pleasure to listen to our most distinguished faculty talk about their work, and I've never been disappointed in the years that I've been coming to these lectures. So 2018, this year, marks the second year of the Lou Anna Day Award. We used to have a version of it called the Research and Scholarship Distinction Award before that. This award was established by Purdue alumna Lou Anna Day to annually recognize Purdue faculty members, a Purdue faculty member who's made a major impact on his or her field in the humanities and social sciences. As you probably know, we have three major awards for the university in sort of three different areas. The Lou Anna Day Award winners are nominated by their peers, and the award is approved through my office and then by President Daniels as well. We're pleased to have Dr. Lou Anna Day with us in the audience today. Please give a hearty applause to the Lauren D. Bain Distinguished Professor Emerita in Public Health and Medicine at the University of Texas School of Public Health in Houston. At this time, I would like to acknowledge any past research and scholarship distinction award recipients, as well as last year's Lou Anna Day awardee, Michelle Buzan. Would you please stand if you've received one of these awards? And there they are. So that was Tom Hurdle, who received the RSDA, and Michelle, who most recently was recognized with this award. And this is just the start. We anticipate having many, many after this. And now I would like to welcome to the stage Department Head and Sociology Professor Linda Renzulli. As the nominator of this year's awardee, she will introduce Professor Ken Ferraro, Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Director of the Center on Aging and the Life Course, as this year's recipient of the Lou Anna Day Award. Linda tells me that she's been practicing a lot, so she'll be really good at this. Come on up, Linda.
Good morning. Dr. Ferraro is the premier scholar in the study of adult health through the life course. The honor of the Lou Anna Day Award is particularly special for Dr. Ferraro, as Dr. Aday is alumna from Purdue Sociology. And it's timely as the university embarks on the 150th anniversary of the Ideas Festival. Dr. Ferraro's work is making giant leaps in health, longevity, and the quality of life. He joined Purdue in 1990 and was awarded the honor of Distinguished Professor in 2008. He currently serves as the inaugural director of the Center of Aging and the Life Course since 2003. CALC, as it is known, is the archetype for centers of its sorts across the country, and it was Dr. Ferraro's conception and execution that makes it so visible, important, and relevant. In his enviable career, Dr. Ferraro has published 120 peer-reviewed articles, 5 edited volumes, 2 sole-authored books, more than 30 other articles, commentaries, and reports, and dozens of conference papers. He's also received 9 grants from the National Institute of Health and edited the flagship journal in the field of gerontology. He does all of that while serving the institution to its fullest. He was including the interim department head in sociology and various committees at all levels of the academy. He mentors and publishes with graduate students and serves as a role model for many. This record of scholarship and this commitment to the discipline was recognized by the American Sociological Association when he received the Matilda White Riley Distinguished Scholar Award. Dr. Ferraro is a sociologist, embracing the core tenets of the sociological imagination. In 1959, C. Wrote Mills wrote, "Neither the life of the individual nor the history of society can be understood without understanding both." Dr. Kenneth Ferraro knows this to be true, and it guides all of his work, most easily seen in his recent book published this year, The Gerontological Imagination. This book is both wholly interdisciplinary and fundamentally sociological. Dr. Ferraro takes the sociological imagination to interdisciplinary audiences. It is no wonder the Gerontological Society of America chose it as the recipient of the Richard Kalish Innovation Publication Award just this year. This work will shape the way researchers study adult health through the life course in dynamic, sociological, and interdisciplinary ways. It is a real treat for me to bring him on stage today. Please help me welcome distinguished professor, Dr. Ferraro.
Good morning. Thank you, Linda, for that very generous introduction, and most importantly, for nominating me for this award. I also appreciate all you're doing for Purdue sociology, and I know you're doing a lot and great work. And thanks to all of you who took the time from your busy schedules to come join us. My 4-year-old granddaughter told me this morning that a lecture is a long talk. Sorry, but that's what you came for. The other thing you could recall is that this place is pretty safe from accidents due to bird scooters. It's a special privilege to receive the Lou Ann Aday Award and to have Dr. Aday here on this occasion. I know well her research on health services research, and she is a shining example of what I call the ICORN legacy. It is a privilege to receive this award honoring an exceptional alumna and former student of the late Robert Eichhorn. I also express my appreciation to the selection committee. I know of many outstanding colleagues at Purdue with scholarly records that just glow. My recognition of their work makes this day even more special for me. And speaking of colleagues, I'm very grateful to be joined by my colleague from the University of Iowa, Fred Walensky, who wrote on my behalf and has been a tremendous support of my work. I remain grateful that Purdue Sociology took a chance on me in 1990, hiring me. My career has thrived at Purdue, and I believe it's due in large measure to the intellectual capital of this university. So many colleagues reviewed my manuscripts, gave me comments, offered encouraging words. This is a great university. I also thank my current and former students. To me, this is a team award. I have said repeatedly that my students make me look good, and that's really true today. I understand that afterwards we have a reception in the Robert Ringgold Gallery, which prompts me to recognize Bob's vision and willingness as provost of this university to start something called a gerontology program. There were other leaders such as Deans Harry Morrison and Dennis Saviano who really bought into this concept of integrating the study of aging on this campus. And now we're moving forward with Dean Reingold and others to take the center to the next level. People who know me well know I'm a family man. 2 of my children and their spouses came to help me celebrate this occasion. Thanks for all those encouraging words over the years. And my most faithful supporter is my wife, Linda. We've been married 40 years this year, so this is a special year. And God's blessed both of our careers. It takes 2 to tango. And I'm thrilled to tango with such a wonderful woman. And now the long talk. My objectives today are twofold. I want to identify 2 frontiers of research on aging. There are dozens of frontiers. I selected 2, but I want to identify those frontiers and tell you a little bit about some of the research that I think is very exciting. Secondly, I want to probe the implications of those frontiers for an integrative paradigm for the science of aging. I've long conducted empirical research. When Purdue hired me, they knew me as a quantitative sociologist. But more recently, I've been doing theoretical and conceptual work. And so by these two objectives today, I'm going to give you a flavor for my empirical work as well as this conceptual work. And if you are familiar with Berlin's analogy of the hedgehog and the fox, I'm going to start my presentation by focusing on the sort of hedgehog approach to research. And then I'll become more of a fox, trying to integrate across research areas. So frontier number one is what I call the early origins of adult health. It really exemplifies the notion of life course analysis. That is, to examine the entirety of the organism from embryo to death, looking for continuity and discontinuity over time, and attending to temporal and contextual factors that influence growing older. Perhaps the most startling research breakthrough discoveries in the 80s and 90s were from David Barker's fetal origins thesis. Barker, a physician, was studying low birth weight babies and was concerned about fetal malnourishment and the long-term effects that this might have. And so he hypothesized and then spent his career developing a program of research that low birth weight would actually result in higher risk of many of the chronic diseases that we know as killers: hypertension, heart disease, type 2 diabetes. He subsequently had to deal with the issue of what we might call accelerated growth. Is it just the fetal malnourishment, or is it the growth that is experienced after this early insult? And he modified some of his findings to say that it was really both, and this is relevant for our conceptualization of health over the life course. So when many people think of health and aging, they think of things that start happening at 65. So it's almost as though genes start tripping off and doing things to your body. And what Barker's breakthrough discovery is that this starts very early, and the effects are not exhausted. Vincent Felitti visited this campus in 2013. The Center on Aging and Life Course brought him in to talk about his adverse childhood experiences study. Another physician, and his research has been on a population of individuals in California. He's at the University of California, San Diego, and as an endocrinologist has been studying eating disorders for years. What he's done is he's amassed records from 13,000 participants in this Kaiser Permanente HMO. And what he has identified is that there are a lot of people that he was treating that had tough lives. Early years were difficult. Early years were challenging. He fashioned questionnaires to, as reliably as possible, get information about those backgrounds, including things such as domestic violence, incarceration, substance abuse, and physical abuse. His findings are scattered across dozens of professional journals. The basic message is that high ACE scores, he took these individual insults, added them together, and said that there was a dose-response relationship. The more of these negative experiences a child faces, the more likely it is to experience health problems. And some of those health problems included things such as hypertension and diabetes, as well as parasuicide, number of sexual partners, etc. Our work over the last 10 years has been following more closely on Felitti's work using two major data sources, the midlife in the United States, as well as the health and retirement study. So what we're doing with the midlife in the United States is we're picking people up in 1995, following them at two subsequent points, and these red dotted lines represent the disease incidence. So it's not just at baseline, but also at follow-up. Then with the health and retirement study, we're doing a parallel sort of analysis, but we have much finer decision points in terms of time, because we have 7 ways so we can look at incidence of disease at specific times, which is very, very helpful for our analyses. This table describes some of the findings and outcomes that we've studied. So we were intrigued by this notion of the various diseases that have been studied by others. And so in the top, we look at cancer, hypertension, heart disease, myocardial infarction, arthritis, and stroke. And so we've been able to replicate those sorts of findings. Some of those findings, however, prompted us to consider other things. So many people are doing a disease at a time, one disease here, one disease there, and we turned it around and asked about other conditions, such as being disease-free in later life. What is the likelihood that people will reach 50 or 60 or 70 years of age and have no disease? That's what most of us want. We want to be free of those kinds of conditions. Comorbidity, which would be the number of diseases that a person gets, psychotropic, drug use, hand grip strength, and peak body mass index. So a wider range of conditions than had been examined earlier, and we're finding links between each of these and these early types of misfortune. As Vincent Felitti said, much of what is unrecognized in childhood is what is now recognized in adulthood. That really there's a lot underneath the skin. Our conclusions are fivefold. Number one, that the early negative exposures are pluripotent. We were the first to say this in 2016 in the American Sociological Review, meaning that these negative experiences have the potential to affect various types of tissues within the body and various types of syndromes that people experience. From osteoarthritis to stroke, there's evidence of affecting lots of different kinds of conditions, even after you control for all sorts of behavioral and lifestyle factors, such as smoking and physical activity. In our search for risk factors, I really think we're in that age where we need to look at it in terms of shared risk factors across various diseases. In the new field called geroscience, dominated by biologists, they talk about the notion of shared risk factors. So if we could cure cancer today, many of the things that we tell people to do to avoid cancer would equally be beneficial for avoiding other conditions. Some diseases that would not be true, but many of the risk factors are actually shared. And that's what we want to investigate. Sociologists talk about fundamental cause theory. What I propose to you today from my years of working on this is that negative childhood experiences are a fundamental cause of disease, many different types of it. Secondly, the type of early exposure matters. So although Felitti likes to add up the conditions, which is fine, that's useful, we've decided to do it a little differently, so we use latent class analyses and look at domains of disease. And after doing 20 or 35 papers on this, we've come to the conclusion that child abuse and low SES, or you could think of childhood poverty, being raised in a home that's classified as poor, are the most robust predictors of the health problems. Those two emerge. Others emerge in other instances, but those two really seem to have the largest effect sizes, and they're the most reliable predictors. We also found that childhood infectious diseases can actually reduce the risk of disease, and this has been surprising and sort of counterintuitive, but we argue that it may be an acquired immunity process going on. So perhaps having chickenpox and measles and mumps as a child actually is good for you, and I think most parents in the room know that, yes, you have to have your kids exposed so that they develop some immunity. We see that happening on outcomes including hand grip strength and stroke risk. Earlier onset of disease. Not only are people getting disease, but they're getting them earlier. So if you just take the different types or latent classes that we talk about and think about having multiples of those, that for each additional type of negative exposure, it correlates to about a 2-year earlier onset of those diseases. It's also comorbidity. not only less likely to be disease-free, but also to get more diseases. So the number of conditions, which is a really important problem in terms of trying to think about the health of older adults. And last, what we call modifiable effects on health. So what I've tried to do in these opening moments is to convince you that there are these links between these early exposures and adult health. But now I'm going to turn the table a little bit and say that they're there, but they're also modifiable. There's a lot more plasticity involved in this process than just determinism. In fact, some people criticize David Barker's work because it was so emphasizing the deterministic quality, that regardless of whether you smoked or not, that there was a biological programming that occurred due to fetal malnutrition, and as a result, you were going to get the condition. Our research shows the opposite, that it really depends upon the context and the life experiences that people feel. So the top arrow shows the exposures, but we also find significant mediators. What I've identified here are 4 of the most important mediators. College education. It's fascinating, but just completing a college degree, not just the number of years you attend, but completing a college degree, the sheepskin effect, that has great benefits in terms of reducing your risk of cardiovascular disease. We actually did some propensity score analyses and examined whether or not people who have exposure to poverty and abuse, family disorganization, are less likely to obtain a college education. And most of the sociologists in the room would say, well, sure, of course, I expected that. But what we found was that even though they were less likely to get a college degree, those who received the college degree got a stronger health benefit in terms of reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease. We could go on with smoking and family support and personal control, but our laboratory basically says these early origins are important, but the effects are at least modifiable to some degree. And so that's what our search is for now. What are the factors that can help us reduce those health risks? So Frontier 1, early origins of adult disease or adult health. Frontier 2, I'm going to get a little more Fox-like here, talking about multifaceted and multi-directional change. So most people, if you walk down the street and ask people about what's it like to grow older, they think of growing older as what I call the cascade of decline. This starts happening to you, and this starts happening to you, and this starts happening to you, and they think, many people think, it is a unilateral, universal decline. Some say aging's not for sissies, but it is for survivors. Aging, and perhaps one manifestation of this would be physical disability. How is it that we would look at the effects of aging on the ability to be able to maintain or perhaps even improve one's physical function in everyday living? So Ken Manton published a few papers in the 1990s that stirred a lot of debate because he said that there was actually a decline in disability experienced in the United States between the years of 1988 and 1999. And that made a lot of people very upset. They thought, this cannot be. How can older people experience a decline in disability? They presume a monotonic effect, right? They presume it's going to continue to increase, and Manton said, well, not so. So that sparked a lot of debate, a lot of journal articles, a lot of ink was spilled trying to figure out what was going on. And at the end of the day, a number of scientists got together and said, we need a panel, a consensus panel, to make sense of this because this is a very important issue for our society when we think of compression of morbidity and what are we doing in adding life to years or years to life. And so Vicki Friedman of the University of Michigan chaired a panel that actually did an analysis of 5 different national data sets in terms of those indicators of disability. And they made three major conclusions. Number one, that there indeed was a disability decline from 1980 to 2000 in the United States of America. They attribute part of that to the Americans with Disabilities Act. That it wasn't so much maybe that the functional ability of the persons changed, but maybe our environment changed to make people more functional. And I think that's part of it. There are also, besides ADA as an act, there are also all sorts of industries that got in the business of creating ambulators and walkers and various things to help people to function. Secondly, disability rates among persons over 65 have remained stable since then. So what we saw a decline in disability that was a historical trend, and it stopped. And the disability has been fairly level since that year 2000, which is, in my way of thinking of it, is a good thing, right? If we can just stabilize the level of disability in a population, that's an achievement as well. Decreasing is even a better achievement, but just stability is good. And then third, the disability increase since 2000 among persons less than 65 years of age. Let that sink in a little bit. So the rate of disability for older people has been stable in the last 15 years, 18 years, but it's actually increasing among persons less than 65 years of age. I won't make too many more comments on bird scooters or electric skateboards, but that raises an interesting question about physical activity, exercise, all those sorts of things that we believe are critical to optimal aging. So again, multifaceted, multi-directional change. When if I would have asked most of you when you walked in this room, is it possible that we could experience a decline in disability among older adults? My guess is most of you would say no. That seems very, very unlikely, but it's happened. Let me give you another example involving brain anatomy and function. So one of the things that physicians, geriatricians, and psychologists are very aware of is that the brain actually shrinks as we grow older. It declines in volume. So there have been all these studies to estimate the weight of the brain and the volume of the brain. And we found out that the declines in brain volume occur especially in the prefrontal cortex and in the hippocampus. If I can get this going here. Now, prefrontal cortex, I think you can see on the front of the person's forehead, that indication there. And the prefrontal cortex is the center of attention, emotional response, and judgment. And then the other place that is the hippocampus, it's sort of like a question mark. It's in a dark golds, and it basically loops around within the brain. In that hippocampus, that's the place for memory, emotion regulation, and spatial navigation. Well, what this question is very important to what we're dealing with today. Is neurogenesis possible in later adulthood? So we know that many mammals create new neurons during the adult phase. The question is, can mammals that reach higher ages continue to create new neurons? That's another contentious area. There's growing evidence that the hippocampus actually manifests some neurogenesis even in later life. Boldrini and others from Columbia University show that this occurs in even 70 and 80-year-old persons, that they can generate new neurons. There actually has been evidence from this for years, and it comes from London taxi cab drivers. Didn't know what that has to do with gerontology. Well, in London, becoming a black cabbie, as they're referred to, the black cab drivers, they have to memorize all of the streets in a 6-mile radius of Charing Cross Station. We're talking 25,000 streets and 20,000 destinations, including restaurants, museums, various things. It takes 3 to 4 years of training to be a black cabbie. And 75% of the people who go to the school to apprentice, to become a black cabbie, actually drop out. So 25% stick with it and become a cabbie. And so when you get into a black cabbie in London, you tell them your destination, and they immediately start figuring out the streets that they need to use to get to that destination. Well, Eleanor McGuire and her colleagues have been doing MRI studies of these black cabbies, and they found a larger posterior hippocampus than the controls. So they're comparing them to other London residents, and they find that when they match the controls, these taxi cab drivers have this larger hippocampus, especially the posterior. It's sort of the latter part of the curvature in that hippocampus. And then they compared them also to bus drivers. Okay, bus drivers have to deal with navigation. They have people stepping out on the roads, etc. But bus drivers didn't have the same hippocampal growth that these black cab drivers had. Instead, she found, surprisingly, that the longer a person drove one of these cabs, actually the hippocampus grew larger and larger. There was actually a dose-response relationship. So it's not saying your whole brain would grow, but it was evidence, early evidence, that the neurogenesis is possible even as people grow older. Again, the brain remains much more plastic than we think. Denise Park and her colleagues advanced the concept of compensatory scaffolding. Compensatory scaffolding. They've been using functional MRIs to show both declines and increases. That it's really an oversimplification to say your brain shrinks and it's all downhill. Instead, they're finding actual increases in the prefrontal cortex. Remember, that's the place where attention and judgment is. So we're seeing two sections of the brain that are responding to being worked and making a difference in terms of their growth. It's again facing cognitive challenge. That's what Denise Park and her colleagues found. Its older brains can recruit additional circuitry. Older brains can rewire if faced with cognitive challenge. They present no evidence that older brains will do this if the lifestyle includes watching Big Bang Theory every night. Rather, they find that there are certain things that are more likely to engage people in this scaffolding. Cognitively engaging tasks, things such as board games, ballroom dancing, playing a musical instrument, learning a new language, things that are hard to do. And I know some of my colleagues who do experimental work, they say sometimes they create experiments where the intervention is so difficult that older people give up. That's precisely the point at which they may be building up their prefrontal cortex. If they would push through the sort of pain, right, or the sense of failure that you can't do these extremely difficult cognitive tasks. Verghese and others found that there are some physical activities that are beneficial for this, but those physical activities also had to involve a lot of mental work. So now I want to think across these two frontiers and synthesize an idea or two about how sociologists, psychologists, biologists, anthropologists, economists think of aging. So let's review. Early Origins is an example of a life course analysis, and it reveals to us that early negative exposures can result in a wide variety of health conditions in later life, a fundamental cause. But there's also modifiability. If people get a college education, if they avoid smoking, if they have a strong social support system, those sorts of things can modify or mediate the effect of those early negative exposures on health in later life. Secondly, there is evidence of adult neurogenesis in the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex via cognitive challenge, even challenging leisure. So in both of these, what I'm arguing is that the aging process is much more modifiable. That was a term that George Maddox used in his Kleemeyer lecture to the Gerontological Society about 20 years ago. The modifiability of aging is very important. On the one hand, we're saying these early influences are important. They can make a difference in people's lives. But on the other hand, we're saying that it really depends on the context and the things that people do in response to that. It's so easy to see aging as this simple, monotonic decline. That's not the truth. The truth is usually found in some level of tension. I like to think of it as the onset and the rate of many declines are modifiable. My goal is not to be a cheerleader and say that aging is easy. It's hard. Sometimes things happen to older people that it feels like getting hit by a ton of bricks, right? And people adjust to a new normal, and they're dealing with lots of challenging things in their lives. But we are saying that there are many things that people can do to affect when those conditions appear, the extent of those, and the trajectory that might result. So if I take those two, they're actually part of 6 axioms that I've developed for a way of thinking about how it is that sociologists, psychologists, biologists, etc., view the study of aging. So on the right-hand side, I've given you 2. Life course analysis, right? That's the early origins research fits into that. Multifaceted change, and that involves the possibility of multi-directional change. Starting at the top, going down counterclockwise, causality. So one of the most important things to say about how gerontologists think is that they're very skeptical of age as a causal variable. Age, Jack Botwinick says, is really sort of an impotent variable. It doesn't really explain anything because it's synonymous with time or coexistent with time, and time does not have physical dimensionality to impinge upon the sensorium, right? So gerontologists are skeptical of what aging really causes. There's lots of things that are correlated with age, but what does age really cause? Ageism, the pejorative view of aging, influences the way we age as well as the science of aging. Ageism is pervasive in our society. It's the forgotten or invisible source of prejudice and discrimination oftentimes. And the irony is that all of us, if we live long enough, may feel it a little bit, perhaps that neglect. Accumulation processes. You know, what I'm talking about in terms of early origins is these accumulation of insults in early life that may lead to the accumulation of diseases or various threats. That's the study of aging. Biologists might be interested in free radical accumulation or oxidative stress accumulation. Psychologists want to know about cognitive reserve, right? How can you create a situation where you have excess capacity to be able to function? And at the bottom, heterogeneity. The amazing diversity of the older adult population. As Joseph Quinn, the economist, said, beware of the mean. I've tried to speak to several different audiences. I'm not talking to everyone, but I'm speaking to several different audiences in what I call the gerontological imagination. So to biological sciences, psychological sciences, social sciences, and the biomedical sciences, what many people would think of as geriatrics. And what I proposed in the book was that these 6 axioms, or these 6 elements, circumscribe how it is that gerontologists think alike. What does it mean to be a scholar of aging? Well, it doesn't mean that you go to professional meetings. It may mean that you share some commonality with persons from other disciplines. And for those of you who are thinking that, well, Ken's sort of forsaken his sociological identity and he's become a gerontologist, my students will tell you that nothing's further from the truth. In writing the gerontological imagination, what I was attempting to do was to find the common ground, the intellectual core. So regardless of whether you were a physical scientist or a social scientist, a cognitive scientist, you were engaged in intellectual work. And I was trying to sort out what those things are. I stretched myself by reading about the prefrontal cortex, because I'm not an expert in it. But I want to know something about that because it's so related to what the aging experience looks like. And so in our program of study here, our dual title PhD program, we require students to get outside of their department and go into another field. So Linda's already mentioned C. Wright Mills and his sociological imagination, also published by Oxford University Press. And I'll end with a quote that I think exemplifies this taking a different point of view in our study. Try to think in terms of a variety of viewpoints. In this way, to let your mind become a moving prism, catching light from as many angles as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. And I guess we've got time for questions. I learned 3 things. I want to be a black cab driver. I had an infectious disease when I was young, so I'll be good as I age, I think. And I should stop watching Big Bang Theory.
Do you want to get the mic? There are mics over on this side, on the...
Another very important cognitive reserve, is this on?
It is.
Okay, thank you. Is the connectivity between the left brain and the right brain,
Yes.
and whether that connectivity is also plastic. And some studies have shown that, the amount of that connectivity is somehow related to survivability challenges. Mm-hmm. And there's also a gender factor involved, which might be hormonal.
This is a wonderful question and comment from one of our distinguished physical scientists. I love it. So I agree with you, first of all, Arden, that again, connectivity is possible. The degree of that connectivity may vary depending upon the tasks that are provided to the individual, the kind of cognitive challenge. But the work of connecting the 2 hemispheres clearly is beneficial to maintaining the intactness of the circuitry. And there is actually, some sociological evidence that men, as they grow older, sometimes take on some behaviors that are a little more like what we define in terms of gender roles as female activities. They become more nurturing. Grandchildren do that, right? And women, in like manner, have to oftentimes face some of these challenges, and in later life, maybe they become more in traditional roles would be seen as the man's role. Some folks thought of it as sort of sex role homogenization. And part of it could be brain, but I think a lot of it is social challenge. I don't know, there might be psychologists in the room who can speak to the MRI research on connectivity in later life. But based upon what I've seen, the interest has been in the prefrontal cortex and in the hippocampus, because those are the areas that typically see the most decline in terms of weight within the brain.
I was fascinated by all the other relationships and the variety of viewpoints you're drawing from. I was also intrigued by the London cab driver, and I've heard that story before. Maybe you could comment to the impact of new technology like this. Are people studying the impact of this on the new London cab drivers, on our memory and cognition, but also in terms of how children are exposed to these technologies from the very early ages that might affect, does it have any effect on the aging processes, or just how they behave and their ways of thinking and how they look at access to information so they don't have to remember it?
Great question in terms of what we can do to perhaps preserve our cognitive reserve. I think the answer to the question is yes, new technologies are affecting our brains. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe next Monday in this room, is it Nicholas Carr is speaking? And he's actually got the thesis that our smartphones are making us dumb, right? And he's not the first person to say, but he's saying it very, very clearly, that there's something about the work of computation and learning directions and navigation that we're missing when we resort to our cell phones or our navigational system. I'm not saying that I don't use GPS, I do, right? But I always try to figure out where I'm going and have some general sense of what's going on. And sometimes it's good to challenge ourselves that way. I think the question about how this will affect the next generation, the children, it's a tough question. My wife and I had a foreign exchange student from Korea in our home for a year, and one of the first things he taught us when he came, Young-min said, Koreans don't use calculators. And so, we're witnessing how Korea and some other nations are doing great in terms of their educational system, and we know that they expect a lot more memory work out of their students. So, I think there's cause for concern, but at the same time, I'm not saying that these things can't be built back up, but I think you're spot on that there are trade-offs. The convenience that we get through our technology could actually not be the best for us in terms of our brain health. And are we willing to take that trade-off? Or will we reach for the calculator when we really don't need to? We're just becoming lazy. That's a challenging question. Very good.
Thank you for a very nice lecture. So my question has to do, the first part of the talk where you talked about the decline in disability rates.
Yes.
1982, 2000, and that was a surprise. So my question is, maybe you can give a little bit more context why that was a surprise. As a non-expert, I would imagine that with advances in nutrition, in medical sciences, et cetera, that we might hope for a continuing, positive improvement in, lifespan, disabilities, et cetera. And so the question is really, apparently that's not the case. Why was this a surprise?
Well, I think it's a surprise for a number of reasons. First of all, nutrition is a complex subject, right? So in some ways, our nutrition has gotten better in the last 50 years. In other ways, I'm not so sure it's gotten better, right? So if you compare us to, say, Dan Buettner's study of the blue zones, where he went throughout the world to try to investigate exceptional longevity in places like Okinawa and Icaria, Greece, and Sardinia, Italy. Those individuals, they eat simpler food, right? It's not as processed food as we get. So we might be proud about the things that we're doing to modify our diet, but we're still not eating the same sorts of foods that others who are living at much longer ages. The other thing is just the decline in physical activity, the increase in obesity. So that period of time that he was talking about, we're seeing a dramatic rise in obesity in the US, and we're figuring that as obesity rate goes up, so will the disability rate go up. Well, that's, again, at the population level. What Manton did was he looked at individuals. And when surveying them, he found that some of them were experiencing, decline. So I think you're right on, Andy, that there might be historical trends. There might be certain periods where there's sweet spots where public interventions such as ADA play a role in decreasing that. And that's the purpose of the legislation, right? But we have to view the aging process in a historical context. The fact that there are blue zones in Okinawa and Ikaria, Greece, and Sardinia today does not mean those people will have the same health status or will see those blue zones in the future. I mean, Okinawa was dealing with this in terms of the fast food prevalence in the country. And so we may not see those things. It's much more historically based than biographically based, right? The individual biography sits in that historical context.
Two more questions. David Sanders.
I had a question about the salubrious effects of childhood infectious diseases. Are we speaking about particular childhood infectious diseases, and are we making the potentially dangerous statement about a comparison between experiencing a childhood infectious disease and being vaccinated for a childhood
Yeah, I
infectious
never
disease?
make dangerous statements. So you have to worry. No, you're absolutely right, David. I think this is an area that's ripe for analysis. So we have in the surveys that we're looking at just 3 conditions: measles, mumps, and chicken pox. And so we just, we analyze our data. Sometimes we say we'll torture the data till it tells the truth, right? And we see that having an infectious disease is related to reducing the risk of some conditions, not others, right? So there's a signal on some conditions, not others. And so there's probably a process here in terms of whatever that infection has done in the body, which you can get the same effect through a vaccine. So again, as these vaccines come through, we may not see that effect. It may disappear. It's historically there. But I think my generation, we recognize that getting chicken pox as kids was not a bad thing. We wanted kids to do that so that they didn't get chicken pox at later ages. So it's the historical context.
Thank you,
Brian.
Ken. Life expectancy has declined in the United States the last 2 years. Much of it is being driven by problems we're witnessing amongst midlife people, not aging seniors. And so smoking is down as a major cause of morbidity and mortality, but we know that amongst midlife adults, obesity is up, alcohol problems are up over the last 20 years. We're seeing evidence that there's actually been an increase with mental health conditions amongst midlife adults. And so it seems like there is this coming wave of problems once this group turns 60, 65 years old. Mm-hmm. And so I was curious what you see as some of the challenges that the gerontological imagination can sort of help us prepare for, as people my age are going to be aging into all of these problems over the next 25 years, probably based on what's going on right now in far worse shape than people who are 25, 30 years older than us. So what can we learn from this that will help us prepare? Yes,
very, very important question, and Brian is so right in saying that life expectancy has declined just very slightly in the last couple of years. It's a modest, but even if it's stabilizing, that's another consideration. When I think of life expectancy differentials, I see socioeconomic inequality and the political economy of those. So if you really look at it by county, some counties in the United States are doing great. They're continuing to experience increases in life expectancy. There are other counties, such as in eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, parts of Oklahoma, parts of North and South Dakota, where there's really sort of a social and political issue around the economies there and the lifestyles in those situations. So I think it's more complex than, say, life expectancy is declining. Some people, in some counties, it's increasing, in others, it's not. I think some of the issues that I would hope a gerontological imagination spurs people to think of is ageism. And if you just think that health problems are a problem for older people, then you don't deal with the things that you're facing right now as a younger person. So instead of, showing off our Superman or Superwoman persona, we need to recognize that we are at risk for these sorts of things, and there's lots of things that we can do to help ourselves make it. I think some people are also dealt with a genetic hand of cards that's hard. And so some individuals, you look at their situation and they're just genetically challenged in the sense that it's going to be hard for them to make it past that. Most of us, it's that we're not living to our genetic potential. We have the ability, probably genetically, to live to 120, maybe 130, but it's our lifestyle, not just individual choices, but our lifestyle. And McDonald's and Big Bang Theory, you can put whatever popular ones you want. But do you really think that we're not going to have a problem in the future because this is how people walk now? This is how my students walk. A lot of them walk. This is how they walk, right? And they're earbudded, and there's going to be curvature of the spine, right? It's coming. You can see it coming. But I think we've got to try to, enable people to see that these right choices are not just individual destiny. A lot of it is about social incentives to make it happen.
Let us thank Ken Ferraro for a fantastic talk.